In this video, I'm going to give you 22 different positional ideas in the Nimzo-Larsen opening. We're going to be talking about all sorts of different systems. We're going to be talking about E5 D5 systems. We're going to be talking about D5 C5 systems, knight f6 G6. We're going to be talking about many different variations. And idea number one is going to be pressure on E5. You always have to put as much pressure on E5 as possible. And that begins as soon as move 2, when you go bishop to b2. This is the defining characteristic of the Nimzo-Larsen, having this bishop fianchettoed on b2. And let's say white plays knight to c6, we will go e3. d5 is the variation that we're going to start out with, and we go bishop to g5. And what I want you to notice in these lines is that everything is designed to pressure e5. So the bishop pressures e5. Bishop on b5 kind of indirectly pressures e5 because it threatens to remove the defender of e5. It's pinning the defender of the e5 pawn. A lot of people actually already blunder here. They play moves like bishop to d7 or a6. And of course, this pretty much immediately loses a pawn and immediately loses the game because you just take the knight, take the pawn, and you are already up a pawn and in a much better position. So this is already fantastic for the white pieces. But a lot of your opponents, of course, are not going to blunder that. They're going to go bishop to d6, which is the main line, and you continue with f4. So this is a very important move. Now, in this variation, because bishop to d6 was played, we are trying to take advantage of the fact that this pawn on g7 is undefended. So if black ever takes on f4, we take on g7. This is another common mistake that happens in these lines. We're going to talk about the correct moves also, but this is a very common mistake. And after bishop takes g7, a lot of people think that they have queen h4 for some reason, but this doesn't do anything, just king f1. Very simply, f takes e3. You have to be a little bit careful. You cannot take the rook because you will get checkmated. So you have to play this move queen e1, offering a queen trade. And let's say black takes, you will just simply take back. If black does something, let's say queen f4 check, you will simply go knight to f3, and this is completely winning for the white pieces. This king is still in the center, and if you're actually able to trade the queens on the next move, you're going to be completely winning. This rook is not going anywhere, so you don't even have to rush taking it. But the main idea in the Nimzo-Larsen opening, and in this line specifically with d5 and e5, is that you want to aim all of your pieces towards this e5 square right here. So this bishop on b2, this bishop on b5, removing the defender, and then this pawn on f4, and in some lines the knight on f3 as well. If they take, not immediately, but this knight in a lot of lines goes to f3, pressuring e5 as well. The two main pawn breaks in this variation are d4 and f4. So these are the two ways you're going to be challenging this pawn on e5. So when bishop to d6 was played, the correct move was f4. The reason why f4 is the correct move here is because we're trying to take advantage of this diagonal right here. And if we go d4, the problem is that black can actually play e4 and keep this diagonal closed. So f4 is a really good move because black cannot take, black cannot push either. So this is just a very nice move. But if black plays something else, let's say f6, which is one of the sidelines in this position, f4 kind of loses its effectiveness, because if you go f4, yes, you're pressuring this pawn, but the problem is you're not pressuring the diagonal itself, because f6 reinforces the dark squares and your bishop is sort of biting into granite. And in these lines, black can just take on f4, and let's say we take back, black can continue developing with bishop f5, queen d7, queenside castle, stuff like that in a lot of lines. So f4 is not as effective against f6. However, what is very effective against f6 is d4. And the reason why d4 is really effective against f6 is because of a couple of reasons. Well, first and foremost, once again, we are pressuring this pawn on e5. That's, of course, the basic idea of this opening. Secondly, black can take on d4, but it's just not that strong because we can actually take with the queen and we can develop our queen. Of course, there is a pin here, so the queen is completely safe. safe, and this way we are opening up our queen with this d4 move, which we could not do with f4. We're not opening up our queen with f4. And also, another very important idea is that if black pushes now, which is one of the main moves in the position, we are entering this structure that resembles an advanced French, but with f6 played by black. And this f6 move is just not a good move in this advanced French structure. If anything, this pawn wants to be on f5, and if black plays f5, that means he wasted a tempo with f6. So he played f6 and then f5, which is technically a waste of a tempo for the black pieces. And in this variation, you can just continue countering with a move like c4. Let's say a6 is played, you can exchange here on c6, and you're basically getting a slightly improved version of the advanced French. So you can go knight to e2. Black might try to play something like f5. You can even play this move bishop to a3. So you don't develop the knight on b1. You actually go bishop to a3 to offer an exchange of bishops. And this is black's good bishop, the dark square bishop, because most of his pawns are on light squares. And if this exchange happens, this is already positionally nice for the white pieces. White is not winning right away, but this is actually very dangerous for the black pieces because you have maneuvers such as, let's say, knight back to b1, knight c3, knight a4, knight c5. And who's going to be challenging you on this c5 square? So you have many different ideas here. You have many dark square holes that you can work with, and I think that this is a very pleasant position to play with the white pieces. Let's take a look at this position from black's perspective for a second, and I want to show you a really cool idea that black has in the defense of this pawn. So there are a couple of ways that black can guard the pawn on e5 in these situations. There's f6, there's queen e7, but the move that I think is the strongest move in this position is this move queen to h4 check. And the reason why queen to h4 check is really good is because after g3, now you drop the queen back to e7. And this pawn weakens the light squares over here on the king side for the white pieces. So how would we as black be able to take advantage of this if we were playing with the black pieces? Let's say knight to f3, we guard this with f6, knight to c3, bishop to e6, both sides just develop, white castles, black castles queenside, white captures on c6, bc6, and then we get this kind of a position right here. But the thing is that in this case, because the light squares are so weak, we have many interesting attacking ideas with bishop to h3, knight f6, knight g4. This pawn in a lot of lines can be used as a hook. So maybe not immediately, but in some lines, pawn to h5 and then pawn to h4 is a possibility, using this pawn as a hook to open up the rook on the h file. So this is a very interesting idea as well. And it would look something like this. For example, this is just a sample line, bishop to h3, rook to b1, knight to g4, knight c5. But the problem is we can even run our king back to the center of the board, and there's just nothing for white, while black has a lot of threats. Black is threatening to go e4 and then go rook to f2, which just wins the game immediately. You kind of have to do something here, but the problem is that there's not much you can do after captures. You have e4 anyways, and your position is just much stronger with the black pieces. This is completely winning for black. But if we were to go back to this position, and if instead of queen h4 and the queen h7 right here, this maneuver, instead of that, if we played queen e7 right away. So let's say we don't give this check, we defend the pawn immediately, we get a very similar sequence of moves just like this. But the problem is in these lines, you don't have the same attacking ideas anymore with the black pieces. The king is much safer on g1 with the pawn being on g2. The pawn is no longer a hook, and there are no attacking ideas with bishop to h3. So the same sequence of moves here actually favors white because you just can't attack. Like there's nothing to attack here. There are no weak squares everything is very compact and everything is very solid. So you can try something like bishop to g4, for example, knight c5, we can get a similar sequence of moves. You can even go e4 to try to win this knight, but you're not going to win this knight. There's rook to b1. There are so many discover attacks on this king. If you go king to a8, there's queen a6, and you cannot take this knight right here because you will easily get checkmated. Bishop takes f6. You're losing the queen and you're getting checkmated. So both monarchs fall here like immediately. So this is just a very bad position for the black pieces. But if you want to play against the Nimzo-Larsen, and if you want to play this bishop to d6 line, you have to include this queen h4 check. Oh, sorry, not queen e7. You have to include this queen h4 check to bait out g3 and then go back to e7. Next up, we have this very interesting idea for white as well. If black plays f6 in a lot of lines, you can play this move queen to h5. And what queen to h5 aims to do is to bait out g6. So both sides want to bait out g3 and g6. And the reason why baiting out g6 is very useful for white is because you drop the queen back to h4 and all of a sudden you've weakened this diagonal at least slightly. So for example, this may not be winning right away. Let's say bishop to d7 is played and you go knight c3. The problem for black is that you don't have as many options anymore because this pawn is on g6. It's not guarding f6 anymore. So in a lot of lines, you can just simply take this pawn on f6. So this inclusion of queen h5, g6, queen h4 weakens this diagonal, allowing you to have more tactical opportunities and even more positional advantages in the future. Idea number 5 is going to be sacrificing the pawn on f4. So in a lot of these queen h5, queen h4 lines, you can actually sacrifice this pawn on f4. So the idea here is that black wants to take on f4 because black sort of doesn't like the pressure on e5, even though it opens up this diagonal, f6 is defended. And black doesn't like the pressure on e5, so black wants to take on f4. But the problem for black is that you don't have to take back. So you can go knight to c3, and if black dares to play this move f takes e3, you simply just take back. Then you queenside castle and you just develop very naturally with knight f3 and then strike in the center with e4. And this just opens up the position completely. This is already winning for white, by the way. Let's say d takes e4 is played. This is just absolutely devastating. Everything, literally everything is weak in black's position. So you sacrifice the pawn with the white pieces, but you gained so much activity in return. And the thing is, for black to actually deal with this gambit right here after e takes f4 and we go knight to c3, the best move is to go knight to e7. And in this case, you can take this pawn on f6. And this is something that black has to know. This goes into sort of a forcing sequence. You take the pawn, you come back, fe3, de3, and this is apparently a slight improvement for the black pieces. So black just gives the pawn back and then takes on e3 and somehow says that he has a little bit more activity on the f file. So this justifies giving back the pawn with black. But are your opponents going to know that? I highly doubt it. This queen h5, queen h4 idea is already a very advanced concept. Them having to realize that they have to take and then give back this pawn on f6 is very unlikely. That's why this opening is so effective, because Nimzo-Larsen is objectively at the computer level not the best opening, but it is a very decent opening and it is a very, very effective opening at the amateur level, because you have all of these interesting ideas that don't really happen in other openings, and black has to know some very precise lines to actually prove his advantage, which is very, very difficult to do in these positions. So now let's talk about some common plans and ideas for both sides. Let's say black plays queen h4, we will go g3, queen back to e7, and both sides are really just developing here. We go knight c3, black defends with bishop to e6, and this is very, very normal. So in this case, you want to make this exchange on e5. The reason why you want to go fe5 is because you want to play either e4 or d4. So your goal is going to be to play in the center. I'm going to talk about both of these moves right now. Before I do that, that though, the reason why you want to make this exchange is that e4 simply doesn't work because this pawn on f4 is hanging in a lot of lines. If you take back, there's d takes e4 first, and in a lot of these lines this is hanging. There's bishop to d5, there are some discover attacks on this king, so that just creates some problems. And if you decide to play d4, then there is e4 and you don't have access to the e5 square, which you will see why this is very important soon. So what we want to do after bishop to e6 is take on e5, and now we have a choice. We can either play e4 in this position, and after a move like d4 we can jump this knight to d5, and of course the queen has to move because it is hanging. Bishop takes d5 is a bad move because this is just not really that great. This knight is hanging. You can try a6 and try to go into this position, for example, and you're not losing a piece in this variation technically, but it's just such an uncomfortable line to play. There are so many weaknesses. You can just castle. Let's say black takes here, there's already knight takes on d4, and if pawn takes, there's queen f3, there's rook e1, which wins the queen. Like bishop e5, you get queen h5, and g6, there's queen takes e5. Okay, maybe you're not losing a whole queen, but this is a completely lost position. All the pawns are falling and white is very, very active. So you cannot take on d5 with the black pieces. You have to move the queen, and then you get into this sort of a scenario where both sides castle on opposite sides, and you can go c4, and something like this can happen, a6, bishop a4. And in a lot of these lines, it's going to be whose attack is going to be faster. So for white, b4 c5 is the main plan in order to kick this bishop out and maybe win the pawn on e5, and also like some sort of b4 b5 is a possibility as well. For black, ideas are going to be something like bishop to h3, h5, h4, knight g4, and start an attack on the white king right here, utilizing these weak light squares, utilizing this g3 hook. So these are going to be the main plans for both sides. Computer always prefers black in these positions. It thinks that black's attack is always slightly faster, but I still think this is a very interesting line to play, and it's something that you can consider. Now going back though, e4 is not the only option that you have. You have d4 as well, which I think is a stronger move. So in this case, there's so much tension on this pawn. Takes is not very good because there's knight d4, which just activates the knight for white pieces. And let's say bishop to d7, there's knight takes d5, hitting the queen and hitting the pawn over here, so or defending the pawn, I should say, and this leads to a better position for white. So black's only good move here is e4, and then you jump this knight into the center. So either you play e4 and jump the c knight into the center, or you play d4 and jump the f knight into the center. So these are both really valid options. I prefer this one, and the reason why I prefer this one is because for black to defend this position, black has to know some ludicrous ideas, and if your opponent doesn't know all of these ideas and they end up in this position, they're completely screwed, because they have to play moves like queen g5, hitting this pawn, giving up the knight on c6. They can't even take this back because then this would be a fork. So what they have to do is they have to play a6, and they can't even play b5 here because there's knight takes b5. So they have to play knight f6, allow white to actually come back with the knight, and they still can't play b5 because of knight b5. They have to play c6 and then play b5. And if they know this line, then they will be able to equalize. But if they don't know this line, the moves are very, very unnatural, and you get a better position immediately. So for example, after a move like knight to e5, if I check the Lichess database, the most common move in this position is bishop takes e5, getting rid of this knight, which will lead to slightly advantageous positions for the white pieces. And if they castle, then it leads to really advantageous positions from this moment on. And these are players that are like 2900. So you can go bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and then queen to d4, and this pawn is hanging, and you're going to be able to start an attack on this king right here with knight a4, knight c5, which means that this is just an extremely dangerous position. Black doesn't have any plans of his own to play the position for an advantage. Black just has to know a set of concrete ideas, such as queen g5, and a set of concrete moves to equalize the game. And if they don't know these moves, such as like queen d2, b5, and then queenside castle, and they have to castle here, and you get a position like this. Or you can even try something like b4, for example, to stop b5, allow your opponent to take here, and then go knight e2, and then like you get into a position like this, which is apparently equal, and then queen takes d2 has to be played here, and castles, and you're down a piece, but somehow it's equal, which is crazy. You can play h3 here, and you go into this crazy sequence of moves, and black has to know all of this. And that's the downside of this line for black, and upside for white, that if black doesn't know any of this, they just get a worse position immediately. I would recommend you to play this d4 sequence if they go queen h4, queen e7, if they play that line. I think this is a very powerful way to play this position. But again, your plans in this position are to strike either with e4 or with d4. I recommend d4, but this is a good line as well. And your goal is to play in the center of the board and attack on the queen side as well. You're not really playing on the king side because you don't have anything over here, but you're trying to gain central control and use the pressure on the knight and use pressure on the center as well. For example, bishop d7 runs into knight takes d5, or takes on d7 first, and then knight takes d5, or even queen h5 and then queen takes d5. There's also this very annoying gambit that you have to know. In this position, bishop d6 is not the only move. There's knight to e7, and some people call this the Lila gambit because the chess engine Lila used this move knight e7 to play and actually fight against Nimzo-Larsen. So this line with knight e7 is extremely effective. At first glance, it looks like that you can take this pawn on e5, and then after black plays e6, you will exchange on c6. And now you have a choice to make. You have to either retreat to b2 or to g3. You can retreat to c3 as well. All of these moves have their pros and cons. But the problem is, if you retreat on this diagonal, there's always queen g5. And you get into these really crazy lines where you either have to play king f1, or you have to play something like queen f3 and then queen g3 and then f4. So you get into these sort of crazy sequence of moves, and these positions just always end up equal or slightly better for the black pieces, in my opinion. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I've done tremendous amount of analysis on bishop to b2. I've done some analysis on bishop to c3 as well. I've done analysis on bishop to g3 as well. And after h5, h4, there's d4 in this line, and black hits the center right away, and you can't even play knight f3 because there's bishop g4. You have to play knight e2, and you get into these crazy forced sequence of moves. And in these positions, black always feels in the driver seat to me, and with white, you're on like a very thin ice. Like any move that you make that's not the best move can lose you the game immediately. So for example, a very natural move, knight takes d4, loses after knight takes d4, e takes d4, and there's bishop to g4 in this position, and after f3 there's queenside castles. So it's a very natural thing to take on d4, but it leads to this line, which is absolutely ludicrous. And if you take, you get absolutely brutalized with rook to e8. So you can't even take. The best move here is actually to play knight to c3, which is insane, but you're still in a much worse position with the white pieces. So because of that reason, I have analyzed many lines, and I cannot recommend to you to take this pawn. I just can't do it. After the amount of analysis that I've done, after the amount of lines that I have looked at, I just simply cannot recommend to take this pawn, because it just leads to positions where black has tremendous amounts of initiative, and you have to be very careful. You can probably get away with it if you are at an intermediate level, but as soon as you hit like 2000 plus, black is going to be winning those games more than white, in my opinion, and it's just really tough. So what I would recommend against knight e7 is to not accept this pawn and go knight to f3 instead, and most likely e4 will be played now by the black pieces hitting this knight. You will jump to e5. pressuring this knight right here. A6 will be played by black. This is the main move. And here there's this one move that you have to remember. There's this queen h5. And if they play g6, you win by knight takes c6. And then knight c6, there's always queen e5. So the best move here for black is to go bishop to e6. And then you get into positions like this, where black has the bishop pair. You have a very nice bishop on b2 though. And the position is not fully open. So these positions are always fine. It's fine that you have a knight, and it's fine that black has the bishop pair, because this bishop on e6 is not that great for the black pieces. And your goals in this position are to go knight c3, knight e2, and then put this knight on d4, or put this knight on f4 in a lot of these lines. For example, knight c3, bishop d6, knight e2, castles. You can play f3 in order to try to get this sequence where you open up the g file. Or if your opponent plays f5, you just simply castle and you're doing fine. It's an equal position. I would say there's a lot of practical value here, especially if you manage to trade off the dark square bishops. If you manage to get this bishop trade, you will have a lot of dark square holes to work with, and you will be left in a better endgame with the white pieces. So for example, I want to set up a position in a way that favors white. It's kind of hard to get it from here, but let's say something like queen to e7, right? And then you go fe4, and then let's say fe4 is played by black, and you play a move like knight to g3, and let's say black doesn't like the bishop on b2 because there's a lot of pressure here. Let's say black plays this move, bishop to a3. This would be a huge positional error, because after this bishop trade, there are so many dark square holes in this position. You can immediately go rook f8 and go queen e5, and your goal here is going to be to maneuver this knight that's on g3 and maneuver it somewhere over here where it's targeting a lot of things. Ideal case scenario is that you will get this knight over to c5 somehow, with the queens also being traded off. You play b3 and you have some sort of maneuver such as knight e2, knight d4, knight b3, knight c5. So you have dark square weaknesses that you can utilize with the white pieces if you get this trade. So for that reason, I think that there is a lot of practical value in this position. Let me go all the way back. I think there's a lot of practical value with this move, knight to f3, and I would go so far as to say that I think this move, knight f3, is objectively better than bishop takes e5. I would personally make that claim. But if you want to argue with me, and if you want to debate the fact that you can take this pawn and get away with it, and you think those positions are good for white, you can play them. But in my opinion, I think in this variation with knight e7, let's call this the Lila Gambit. In the Lila Gambit, I think knight f3 is the best way to go. I don't think you should accept this pawn. Next up, we're going to be moving on to d5 systems, and let's say after d5 we go bishop to b2, black plays c5, we go e3, so all the same moves, and after knight c6 we go bishop to b5. The idea of this segment is going to be about the c4 pawn break. So I'm going to show you multiple different lines. There are going to be multiple ideas here, but I wanted to group them into one section because they're all very related. So for example, let's say we go into this sequence of moves right here. Both sides really just develop, nothing crazy. Knight f6, we go d3, bishop to d6. This is a very normal line. We basically take on c6 and we put the knight on e5. Thing about these positions is that black's main pawn break in these lines is this move, pawn to c4. So black is going to seek a lot of activity with this c4 pawn break. Let's say f4 is played here by white, b5, queen to e2, and actually the best move already in this position for black is c4. The reason why c4 is such an important move is because it opens up the c file for the rook, it opens up this diagonal for the bishop, and it allows you to get a lot of activity on the c file. So for example, after bc4 and this exchange on the c4 square, we can even win a pawn, but the problem is that there's always compensation. Let's say queen c7, and if knight to d6 is played, there's rook c2, intermezzo, hitting the knight still, and also hitting the queen and the bishop on b2. So this is a very, very nice way for black to gain a lot of activity. So c4 is the main idea of black. That's why in a lot of these positions, white actually can play this c4 move himself. And what this move aims to do is to freeze this pawn on c5. So if this pawn does not move from c5, that means that the rook will stay passive because you cannot actually activate this rook on the c file. So with this move c4, the pawn is frozen, so the rook will not activate, and the bishop's activity will also be quite limited. So this is a very, very interesting idea as well. And if bc4 is played, you can either go bc4 or you can go dc4 as well. Both of those are reasonable options. Let's say captures here. You can play knight takes c4, and you have some weaknesses to work with in this case. So if black makes a lot of exchanges, you will be able to create some weaknesses and some targets in black's camp. You can go queen a4 to target this, target the rook. This pawn is also an isolated pawn that is easily targeted. So you are in a very pleasant position with the white pieces. So this is another idea that white has as well to stop black's activity. And also going even further back, in a lot of these lines, if you noticed, in this case, I played this move bishop to d7 with black. So this is one of the lines. But you can play many other moves here. You can play knight to f6 with black. You can play e6. So you have different options. The thing about these positions is that if black does not play bishop to d7, if black plays anything else, you can actually take this knight on c6. Now, ideally, you would like to be provoked. Let's say black plays a6. In this case, you would take. And the problem for black is that this a6 move is just an useless move. And they provoked you to make a decision, so you took. But even if they don't provoke you with a6, it's still good to take on c6 anyways. And in my opinion, this is actually a really, really good way to play by not even waiting for black to play a6 and taking on c6 regardless. And the reason why this is good is that now the b pawn is there's no longer a b pawn, right? This pawn took on c6, which means that black in the future will not be able to play b5, and that means that black will not be able to support c4. This pawn is on c6, it's not on b7, it cannot go b5, it cannot support this c4 pawn advancement. That means that you're going to have greater control over this c4 square. So if you get the same sequence of moves here now with knight f3, d3, and I want you to notice something as well. Everything in white's position is designed to control c4. So the knight on knight's not on e5 right now, but if the knight moves to e5, which it will move to e5 very soon, it controls c4. The knight on d2 controls c4 as well. The pawns on b3 and d3 control c4, and the queen that's going to come to e2 is also going to control, like let's say rook e8, you can play queen e2 immediately. You can even play queen e1 because c4 is just simply not a threat. Queen e2 is one of the best moves as well. Everything is about controlling this c4 square, and this exchange on bishop takes c6 is justified because it reduces black's control over the c4 square in the long run. So that's why it's really good to take on c6 even if you're not provoked and if black allows you the opportunity to take. I think the best move in this position is bishop to d7. I don't think you should allow white to take here and double your pawns. I think the best move is this bishop d7 approach, but if your opponents play a move like e6 or if they go knight f6, take on c6 immediately and double your opponent's pawns, so their c4 pawn break is going to be significantly less effective from here on out. Okay, so we talked about black's plan to play c4 in these positions, but what is white's plan? What does white do? So for white, what you want to do is actually in a lot of lines, you want to get a very powerful kingside attack. So this bishop on b2 is aiming at the king. This knight can jump to e5, close to the king as well. Sometimes the queen goes out to g4 when the knight is gone, or even goes out to h5 as well. Let me actually show you what's going on. Say a5, you will go a4 to stop the pawn. Queen c7, queen e2, both sides just simply developing and putting their pieces on good squares. Once again, notice how we're controlling c4 in this case. And rook b8 is a good move by black because it sort of helps c4 because you cannot take with a b pawn because the bishop would be hanging. So this is another really interesting move by black in order to try to enable this c4 move. But in this case, white has a better position. And if black doesn't play c4 immediately, it's actually the best move. You should play c4 here, and after dc4, you're supposed to play knight d7. This is the only way. So you just give up the pawn and be okay with it somehow. This is what the computer recommends. For humans, this is very difficult to do, and they might play something else, such as like rook f to e8, for example. And in these situations, you have a very nice rook lift with rook to f3, and then rook to h3. So this again can be split into different ideas, like this rook f3, rook h3, rook lift. I could have talked about this idea in a whole separate segment of the video, but I think all of these things are really closely related, so I chose to keep them in the same group and keep them in this kingside attack category. So for example, after rook to f3, let's say g6 is played or something like that, or even h6, you're gonna go rook to g3 here. Let's say g6 is played with the idea of maybe bringing this bishop back to oppose the bishop on b2. You will go rook to h3, and say knight to d7 is played with the idea of going back once you trade the knights. You already have knight takes f7 here. This is another very important sacrifice. I've had lines where this was a move and I actually missed it in some of my games, and that's how I learned that there is this knight f7 move in these positions. And after king f7, rook h7, king has to go back, queen to g4, coming in with an attack. If the king takes the rook, it's actually just checkmate in 3 moves, queen h8 and then queen g7 checkmate. And if black doesn't take, well, the best move is knight e5, and if knight e5 has to be played, I mean, it's just over at this point because everything is under attack. You can go bishop takes e5, say queen takes h7, bishop takes d6, hitting this rook. And after this sequence of moves, as you can see, technically we're down in exchange, but we have so many pawns. This is a really weird material count here. So if we nullify everything, even like these pawns right here, we can nullify all of these pawns. We have a knight and 3 pawns for a rook. So we are up in material. And as a matter of fact, this knight is better than this rook in terms of quality. So not only we are up in material, we are up technically 1 point of material, but the quality of this rook is really bad, and the quality of this knight is still better than the rook. So it feels like you're up even more material when technically you're not. So this is such a powerful position for the white pieces, and black is just feeling very, very sad here. Next up, we have the idea of keeping the bishop pair for the black pieces, and let me show you what I mean by that. So in this position, let's say we take on c6. Our goal is to play knight e5 in these lines, but we cannot play knight e5 immediately because there's knight takes e5, bishop d7, this knight comes back, and this is just, of course, winning for black. Black is up a piece. So the way we mitigate this is by taking on c6, and we jump the knight to e5. Now, a very common mistake in these positions is bishop d6, allowing us to take this bishop and double the pawns. If you can take the bishop and double your opponent's pawns just like this, do it right away, okay? Don't wait. Do not play a move like f4 here. Do not play a move like d3. If you can take this bishop and double the pawns, do it right away. Most likely, black will play a move like rook to c8, and then you can take anyways, or you can continue developing with a move like d3. Let's say bishop to d6, knight to d2, and castles by the black pieces. And now this is your final opportunity to take on c6, and I think you should. In this case, a rook to c8 was played by black, and you cannot double black's pawns because black will simply take with the rook. But you should do this anyways, because if you don't do this, there's a very interesting idea which I have actually used in the past with the black pieces. So let's say white plays a very natural move in this position, f4. Just reinforcing the knight on e5. You're trying to claim that the bishop on c6 is better than the knight on e5. But the problem is that there's a very interesting idea here, bishop to e8. And this is really, really cool. I've used this bishop e8 move to win some games. And the idea here is to just simply keep the bishop pair, and this bishop will come out on this diagonal or even to h5 in the future. So your goal is to move the knight either to d7 to challenge this knight, or you can even play moves like, let's say you play queen to f3. There are ideas even like king h8, knight g8, and f6. So crazy ideas just like this. And these positions just end up being very uncomfortable for white because in the long run, the bishop pair is extremely powerful. So king h8 is a bit of a rare move though. Most commonly, probably knight d7 is something that you would face in this position if you were to get it. And after knight d7, bishop d7, this is the position that you get. And I think the bishop pair is very powerful for black. Black can still play b5, c4. Black is going to play f6 to mitigate the power of your bishop. Let's say you go queen to g3. There's always f6, and now this bishop is just simply really, really restricted. So in these positions where your opponents go bishop to d7, just like this, you want to take on c6, you want to put the knight on e5. Ideal case scenario is that you take on c6 and double opponent's pawns. But if they go rook to c8, you're going to have to take on c6 anyways once they castle, because you do not want to allow them to go bishop to e8. Next up, I want to move to a different variation in the d5 system, and this is the bishop to g4 move. Now, in this case, I want you to know something very specific. A lot of people here like this variation with h3 and g4. Well, those who haven't studied, because if you have studied this, this might look very natural because, okay, bishop g4 is a weird move. I cannot play e3 because I hang my queen. I don't want to play knight f3 because black can actually take. But the problem with h3, g4 is that this is positionally wrong for the white pieces. Black is very happy to see this variation by white. So after bishop to g6, the problem here is that this pawn is a hook. It becomes a target. Say you play bishop to g2, very natural move. Now there is h5 targeting this pawn. Let's say you go g5. And then black has knight to c6, knight to f3, and e5. So it looks like with knight f3, you're controlling this e5 square, but in reality, it doesn't quite work because after knight takes on e5, knight takes e5, bishop e5, there's queen g5 at the end of this sequence with a fork. And after a move like bishop to g3 covering, there's h4. So this just ends the game right away. So of course you cannot take this pawn. That's what I'm trying to say. You have to do something else. You have to go h4 to guard this pawn. But now f6 and black gets the whole center. And in these variations, when you go h3 and g4, this e5 move is a very real possibility. And black taking the whole center is a very real possibility, and it's something you want to avoid. Now, you have a couple of different options from this position when black plays bishop to g4. You can play f3. I find this to be a bit suboptimal. It's not my favorite choice, but people like it, and it scores kind of well in the Masters database. So you can consider something like this, for example, with a move like knight to c3, knight c6, and then knight g to e2, and then slowly develop. You can play g4, h4 in some positions and get a kingside attack. So you get like some sort of a reversed Jobava London here, but there's a knight on c3, and you don't necessarily have an optimal setup with white. I'm not a huge fan of this, but it's all right, I would say. But my favorite option is actually not the main line. Main line is g3, going for the double fianchetto. My favorite option is actually knight to f3. And knight f3 is a very hotly debated variation. But in my opinion, it's actually probably better than g3. And the reason why I like it over g3 is because a very common move here, the move that people are usually worried about, bishop takes f3, I don't find this variation to be that challenging. People don't really know how to play this position from here with the doubled pawns, so they're usually worried about this. So play could go something like, let's say, e6. Now you have to know this setup right here. You have to play g3 and you have to put the bishop on g2. If they go h5, you go h4 yourself. You don't want to let them play h4. So you go h4, they go c5, bishop to g2, knight f6, and then you want to go c4. And your goal here is to go f4 as well. So you need f4 and c4. This can be done in different move orders. For example, you can start with f4 and then play c4. As far as I know, I don't think there is a huge difference. So you have to play c4 and f4, and the goal is to open up this bishop right here by playing c4. You're supporting the bishop on g2, challenging the pawn on d5. And if black plays a very natural move, which is d4, now you can take on c6. And the upside here when you take on c6 is that black gets this very ugly structure. Now you can play d3, you can go queen f3. And what happens in a couple of moves is that usually black likes to get rid of this isolated pawn by playing a5, a4. And then you want to take this pawn and you're left with this pawn on a2 that's a passed pawn, and this is what you're going to be working with. So if you're able to successfully activate your pieces here with a3, rook to b1, and if you're able to trade some pieces off, any king and pawn endgame is going to be winning because you have a passed pawn on a2, while black's equivalent for this pawn on a2 is the pawn on c6, which is completely frozen. This is a very bad pawn. So effectively, you are up a pawn in these variations. Not technically, but it does feel like it since this pawn is so strong. So I personally find this variation to be very, very good, but a lot of people don't like it. So, you know, you can use that information how you like. You can experiment and choose which variation you like, but you have to remember that h3, g4 is not what white wants. This is playing into black's hands because black is able to challenge this pawn and black is able to get the big center. Now, what happens when they don't take, and let's say they play knight to d7, which is actually the most played move in this position over this bishop f3 move. So let's say they play knight to d7. You have a very clever idea in these positions that I think you should always go for, and that is an early knight h4 idea to trade your knight for this bishop. So now you will play e3, let's say knight to f6 is played, and now you want to play h3. Now you don't mind if black takes because you will simply take with the queen, and then you will get the bishop pair, and this is totally fine. But going back, let's say bishop to h5 is played. Our goal here is to go g4, and I would even recommend g5. And the reason why I would recommend g5 is because most of the time knight to e4 should be played, because knight on h5 sort of becomes a target with rook g1, bishop e2. The knight tends to get trapped on h5 here in a lot of lines, and with knight g8, I mean, you're just going back. This is kind of miserable and not what I would recommend. So most of the time you will see knight e4 here. You can play d3, and then you can go knight h4 to go after this bishop. And I think this is a very, very powerful idea. This is a very interesting idea. And after you take hg6 and you go h4, you will get this type of a position where you have the bishop pair, and these positions are always going to be slightly better for the white pieces. But what I don't want you to do is I don't want you to miss an opportunity to play g4, knight h4. I don't care so much about the move order. Like, for example, you can go g4 and then you can go g5 immediately, or you can go knight h4 even right now, for example. And if a move like bishop to e4 is played, you can play f3 and then you can take in the future. This is also a very interesting and a good way to play, as long as you don't miss the opportunity to go after this bishop. Because if black is able to get h6, let's say you play a move like bishop to e2 or something, black can play h6, and now same ideas don't work anymore, because if you play knight to h4, the bishop just simply drops back to h7. So this knight h4 idea is a positional threat which will win you the bishop pair, and I think you should go for this line every single time whenever you have positions like this with knight to d7. Okay, now I will teach you what to do against sort of the reverse London system against the Nimzo-Larsen. Now, unfortunately, this might sound really annoying, but the thing is, this is a very solid opening. The London, especially against Nimzo-Larsen, is extremely solid, and there are not a lot of good ways to win against this immediately. As a matter of fact, there are no immediate ways to punish bishop f5, but I'm gonna teach you some tricks that exist in this position. So after knight to f3, e6, e3, knight to f6, bishop e2, and now black has to be careful. It might sound really weird. Okay, why does black have to be careful here? There's nothing going on. If they don't play h6, let's say they play a move like knight to d7. This allows knight h4. So this is an idea that we just talked about, and if you get this in your games, you should play it immediately. Do not castle in this position. go knight h4, they will go bishop to g6, and you don't have to take on g6 immediately. You can castle now, for example, but let's say they continue with a move like bishop to e7, d3 castles. At some point you want to take. But if you manage to play knight to h4, let's go all the way back. If they allow knight h4 with like knight to d7, with a move like c6, for example, you play it, no questions asked. Even if they go bishop to e7, I still think knight h4 is a strong move here, even though in this variation, computer doesn't particularly love knight h4 as much, but I still think you should play knight h4 because it gives you a lot of practical opportunities because you're going after the bishop. So in this case, the only good move in this position is pawn to h6. A lot of people are not going to know this, but for those who do know this, this is what you will do. You will go d4, you will castle, you will go c4, and then you will put the knight on c3. So very basic stuff, very basic queen's pawn stuff here. And now after a move like knight to d7, this move is going to look a little bit weird, but what I want you to play is this move bishop to d3. Now this might look a little bit weird. Why did we go bishop e2 and now we're going bishop d3? But this is an actual idea in the London system as well, because if we were to play bishop d3 or like early in the game with this pawn being on h7, the problem is that this bishop would have retreated back to g6. But in this case, this bishop cannot retreat back to g6 because we take and we damage the structure. The pawn is on h6. So when we go bishop to d3 right here, this sort of forces black to take. Black shouldn't necessarily play knight to e4 either, because then you go queen to c2. And let's say black plays knight to f6. In this case, you want to play either knight e2 or you can play knight e5 as well. And you're going to build up a lot of pressure on this diagonal right here. So this is a very interesting way to play. This is like typical London stuff. Most likely, black will take. And after you take back, rook to e8 will be played. And your goal is going to be to set up e4. And you have to do it the right way. So rook to d1, let's say rook f to d1. If a5 is played, which is a very interesting move. So queen b6, queen a6 is the idea here with a5, and also potential ideas with a4. But what you're going to do is you're just going to develop normally. You're going to go a4, stopping a5, and eventually you're going to go back here because the pawn was under a lot of pressure. And eventually you will be able to set up e4. So this, in my opinion, is one of the best ways to challenge this sort of a reverse London setup. There are not a lot of good ways to fight against this. But once again, I'm going to summarize everything. If you get the opportunity to play knight to h4, do it right away. If not, go for the idea that I showed you. If they play h6, go for the idea that I showed you with the bishop to d3 here, trading off these bishops, and then eventually playing for e4. Now we're going to move on to a different variation. We're going to be moving on to knight c6, knight f6 lines. So in this position after e3, let's say knight f6 is played by the black pieces, we go bishop to b5, and the idea number 14 is going to be this move, bishop to d6. Black can put this bishop on d6. Now, why can black do this? When we teach beginners chess, we tell them that they should not put pieces, or they should not put bishops in front of their central pawns. And this is true, but there's a specific idea behind this bishop d6 move. Now, you see this bishop right here on b5. This bishop in a lot of lines can become a target by playing this move pawn to c6 or even pawn to a6, but we're going to be focusing on pawn to c6. Now, I will show you these lines a little bit later on. Of course, right now, c6 just simply cannot be played because there's a literal knight there. You cannot swallow your own knight. However, the idea is that in a lot of lines, this bishop actually goes back to c7 after the pawn goes up to c6. And this bishop maintains the defense of the pawn on e5, while black will be able to play d5 in the future when this bishop goes back. So that is the idea behind this bishop to d6 move. In some lines, this bishop drops back to e7 as well. For example, if this bishop goes back to e2, which is one of the main lines in this position, because after bishop to d6, there's really no need to take on c6. So white drops back the bishop on e2, so it does not become a target. And this bishop can actually go back to to e7 itself. And there's another idea that I forgot to mention. The reason why you play a move like bishop d6 is because you want to play a move like d5 in one go. So we're going to talk about this variation with d6 later on, but the problem with d6 is that it blocks out the bishop. And you also don't necessarily want to play d6. You technically want to play d5, but if you play d5 right now, it's a very bad move because just a very simple bishop takes e5. You lose the pawn with black and you lose the game as well. But black can play this move instead to gain a tempo with c6 or a6 later down the road. Now, a very interesting way that a white can take advantage of this bishop to d6 move is by playing knight to a3. Now, after knight a3, the idea is to go to c4 to go after the bishop. So, a very simple plan. And a lot of people in this position play this move pawn to a6. And pawn to a6 is one of the variations. It's not the main line, and it's also not the most testing line, because after bishop takes c6, d takes c6, we go knight to c4, we put more pressure on the pawn on e5, queen e7, defending the pawn, we go knight to e2, and let's say black plays b5. Black can play a couple of different things. Black can castle also, and then we will castle as well, but b5 is the main move in this position, and we take on d6. And this position, it looks equalish, but it is deceptively dangerous for black, and white has a lot of chances. If you castle, let's say black castles as well, you can go knight to g3, and then you can play pawn to f4, and now this bishop is being activated, this rook is being activated, the knight is also very close, so it cannot jump to either f5 or h5 right now. Well, h5 it can, but it's not that useful currently. But it's around here, and it has the possibility to jump into black's territory in order to attack some squares over here. And this queen at some point can also come to support on the f-file, or if the knight is removed, it can go to h5 also. So you have lots of attacking opportunities, and this is, as I said, a deceptively good position for white. So for example, a move like e takes f4, this is nearly losing already, because bishop takes f6 is being threatened, so you have to move the knight away, and then this rook goes back. And as I said, this knight can go to h5 in a lot of these lines to attack this pawn, and it's not so easy to deal with this idea. So there is tremendous amounts of pressure on black in this position. Let's say you play a move like now bishop to e6, for example, there is e4, the knight has to go back, there is d4 blasting the position open, and takes would actually just win the game for white immediately with a fork on g7 and also an attack on the knight. So this is an extremely dangerous maneuver, this knight to a3 and knight to c4, like this, knight a3, knight c4. And a very unique way that white can deal with this is by playing this move knight to a5. And also knight a5, in addition to controlling c4, because now knight c4 is not good because knight takes, bishop takes, and this is completely fine for black. So this is just not a good move for the white pieces. In addition to controlling the c4 square, it also enables c6. And now we see the justification of bishop to d6. After knight to a5, c6 comes with a tempo. So for example, if you play a move like knight to f3 in this position, let's say, c6 can already be played, followed by queen e7. Or if the bishop goes back willingly, in this case, you can go back with your bishop as well. And yes, this is a waste of a tempo, technically, going bishop d6 and bishop back to e7. But so did white. White wasted a tempo going bishop b5 and then bishop back to e2. So both sides just wasted tempi. You cannot take the pawn because the knight on a3 is hanging. So this knight a3, knight c4 maneuver is very powerful if it lands for white, but there are ways that black can mitigate this by playing knight to a5, and we're going to discuss these positions very, very soon as well. Now I'm going to talk about a very interesting tactic that can happen on this knight. So let's continue with this variation. Let's say knight to f3, queen e7, defending the pawn and also attacking this knight. So the knight has to go back. Castles by black, and now bishop back to e2 by the white pieces. Let's say c6 is played by black in order to execute the idea that we were talking about, dropping the bishop back to c7 and then playing d5. Castles by white, bishop c7, and now b4. So as you can see, if the bishop is still on d6, it controls the b4 square. But as soon as the bishop moves back to c7, there are potential tactics with b4. Now, miraculously here, this position is not lost for the black pieces. So in order for black to actually be equal here, black has to take the pawn and allow bishop to a3. So this is the whole tactic. You're basically skewering the queen and the rook. Otherwise, the knight is basically trapped, right? So you have to take this pawn. Bishop to a3, queen goes back to b6. You take the rook, king takes back, and then you play d5, and you get a position like this, where apparently this position is only slightly favorable for white, because there are some very, very specific ideas for black to know. So for example, knight to c4 has to be played, and after this exchange right here, c5 has to be played, and there's a very, very particular idea here. After c5, what black is trying to accomplish here is that black is trying to transfer the queen over here. So he's trying to create an attack on this pawn on h2, and also this c5 move opens up queen's way to h6. So after c5, we get a sequence like this, bishop takes h2. So we get a Greek gift sacrifice basically, and after queen to h6, this leads to a forced draw if knight goes back to f6 and bishop to h3 is played. So the very, very advanced high-level idea. Again, your opponents are not going to know this, so this whole idea of b4 bishop to a3 is going to work significantly better, because a lot of your opponents, okay, they might play this sequence right here, but they might not find a move like c5. They might play something that looks a little bit more natural, maybe, I don't know, bishop to g4. But of course, this is not a good move, because now you're up in exchange, and if you're able to consolidate successfully with white, then you're just going to be much better, because you are up an extra rook. Your opponent does not have a rook, you have a rook for a bishop. So this is going to be a very good position for the white pieces. And remember this tactic with b4 and bishop to a3 when the bishop drops back to c7. This is a common tactic in a lot of lines. Now I want to show you another line. Let's say knight to f3 is played here. This is the same line that we saw earlier, but I want to show you this idea of knight to h4, knight to f5. Now this is a very, very interesting idea. Now the reason why this knight h4 move is really strong in these positions is because it immediately tries to take advantage of the fact that black hasn't moved the d pawn, and black does not have the control over the f5 square, because the bishop is simply not controlling it, the pawn is in the way. So in these positions, a very, very common way, so queen e6 is the best move technically, but a very natural way to play here with the black pieces would be to play something like g6. And this is actually slightly wrong, because in a lot of these lines, okay, you will drop your bishop back. That's very typical in these lines. And let's say black plays b6. Instead, c6 is also possible, but let's say black chooses the b6 line to avoid any b4 shenanigans, right? Because if you go back to c7, there's b4, as we just talked about. Idea of b6 is to create this square, getaway square for the knight on a5. So in this case, we will castle, and let's say c6 is played now. We have a very interesting idea. c4, first of all, improving the position. And then queen to c1, which is a very interesting move, trying to bring the queen over to c3. Queen c2 is a little bit inaccurate, because in a lot of lines after d5, there's dc4 and then c takes b3, and bishop f5 comes with a threat on the queen. So this queen right here is vulnerable. It's not immediately, of course, but in a lot of lines, this knight goes back to f3. Of course, it does not remain on h4 for long, and when it does, there's always like bishop f5 stuff. So that's why queen c1 in this case is more accurate than queen c2, slight nuance here. And after d5, here white can play f4, and this is another advantage of playing knight to h4. It's not just a one move threat where we were threatening knight f5 to win the bishop pair, black defended it, and that's it. No, there was another idea behind it. Knight h4 allows us to play f4, so it frees up the pawn. We can push it to f4, and if they play g6, this is very good for the white pieces, because in a lot of these lines, when this diagonal opens up after g6, this king is much weaker. If this pawn was back here on g7, this would be a slightly different story. But this pawn is on g6, which means that dark squares are up for grabs. Queen c3 is a very powerful move that comes with a lot of force. So in a line like this, for example, d takes c4 can be played, knight goes back to f3 attacking this, and then let's say e takes f4, you will go queen to c3, bishop to d8, a very miserable looking move, and this goes into a very weird sequence of moves. I'm not going to show this whole thing because this is already too much depth. I feel like you guys can check out this position by yourself if you click the study link in the description, so you guys can analyze this on your own from here on out. I just wanted to highlight the idea of knight to h4 here, why this knight f5 threat is so important, and after g6 how we can play f4 in a couple of moves, and then this bishop is very powerful on this diagonal. Now, another very common mistake that you need to know with the white pieces, or a common mistake by black, is that if instead of bishop to b5 in this position, you choose knight to f3, which is a very reasonable move. It's a sideline, but it's still a very reasonable move. Some people will still play bishop to d6 here, and this is actually inaccurate. The whole reason why bishop d6 works against bishop b5 is because even though this is a loss of a tempo, because in some lines you're going to have to go back and in some lines you're not going to be able to get this bishop c7 move, the reason why this sort of a tempo loss is justified is because this bishop becomes a target. So whatever tempo that black loses by playing bishop d6 and later on bishop e7 is justified because black gains that tempo back by playing c6 and threatening this bishop, or white retreating this bishop willingly, for example. But against knight f3, none of that really exists, right? Because if bishop to d6, there's no target for black. Black cannot target the bishop on b5 because there's no bishop on b5. And in this case, we would continue with a move like d4, and after e takes d4, we would go pawn takes d4, and we would get a position like this. It is a symmetrical position, but the problem is that now this bishop is just completely misplaced on d6. It just does not belong here, and you never really won a tempo, so you're just going to have to retreat this bishop to f8 at some point, and if you don't retreat it, then it's going to become a target after like knight c3, knight b5 in a lot of these positions, and this is going to be slightly uncomfortable for the black pieces. This pawn chain is really good at restricting this bishop, and if knight to e5 is played, of course we take. We have discover attacks on this rook right here. And if this knight goes to e7, well, this just looks very miserable, right? Because you want to play knight to b5, you want to threaten d6 to create some weaknesses, a6 has to be played, and then you even have tactics like knight takes c7, queen takes c7, bishop takes f6, and then d6 at the end, forking these two pieces. The queen has to move, obviously queen c5 takes, and then queen takes on e7, and all of a sudden we get a position like this, where black has an isolated pawn and also doubled pawns on the king side, which is very uncomfortable for him, obviously. So you have to remember that this bishop d6 move does not work. Let me go all the way back. Bishop d6 does not work against knight f3. Against knight f3, you have to play either d6, which we're going to talk about very soon, or you have to play e4, which is going to go into completely different lines with knight to d4, bishop to c5, d3, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop b6. And in this position, this very clever move, knight to d2, you don't necessarily want to take. You actually want to play knight to d2, let them take you. If they do, you're able to develop your bishop and you're able to get a lot of activity. And this is somewhat fine for the black pieces. It's not the end of the world. It's maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but it's fine for black. But if you play a bishop d6, then it's going to be really uncomfortable against knight f3 because this bishop is going to be misplaced and it's going to be a target for a very long time. So now let's briefly talk about these e5 d6 systems. So after bishop to b2, let's say either d6 is played immediately or knight c6 and then d6 is played by the black pieces. And something that you have to know about these positions is that, okay, you can play knight f3 and you should play c4. Once you play c4, you're basically playing reversed closed Sicilian. So the main plans in this position are going to be to expand on the queen side. So you're going to develop bishop e2 and a3 and castles, and then you're going to play b4, b5, and you're going to go knight c3, a4, a5, and you're going to start some sort of an attack on the queen side. So that is your main plan if the position stays closed. But if the position opens up, for example, let's say rook e8, castles, and d5, you will enter reversed open Sicilian positions. But the problem for black in these lines is that you're playing reversed Sicilian, but you are up 2 tempi. And the reason why you're up 2 tempi is because you have 1 extra tempo because you're playing with the white pieces. You're playing Sicilian with white, so that gives you an extra tempo. And the second tempo comes from the fact that d6 and d5 has been played in 2 moves instead of 1. So that's very, very uncomfortable for black. And if they ever go for these open systems, they might be in some trouble very, very quickly. Like, for example, in this position, white is already much better. It's already plus 0.8, plus 0.8. And you can play maneuvers such as knight d2, knight d4, knight c5, or knight d2, knight b3, knight c5. And you already have like game-winning ideas if black is not careful. And this is just going to be better for the white pieces. So most likely what black should do in these positions is to keep the positions closed, probably move this knight and go for some sort of a f5, so reversed close Sicilian is most likely what they should play for, in which case your main plan is going to be queenside expansion, and that is the idea of these positions. I'm not going to go too much into depth here. I might make a Sicilian video in the future, maybe not immediately after this one, but I will make an opening masterclass on the Sicilian defense as well. And I think that studying closed Sicilian positions is going to benefit you greatly if you want to know what to do against this line. There's another interesting idea that you have to know in these d6 e5 systems, and that is that if you choose to go for knight f3 and d4 in these positions and they go e4, so black plays e4, you have to be really careful, because if you just drop the knight back, you're going to be entering this structure which resembles something like an advanced, no, it doesn't resemble, it is literally an advanced French structure but with reversed colors once again. And as a matter of fact, it's not just an advanced French structure, it's actually an improved advanced French, because in a lot of these lines you have to play f3 because this line has been played with knight f3, knight d2, so you have to fight back with f3. And the problem in those positions is that after this capture, the pawn on e3 is weak. Now, typically in the advanced French lines, there's a bishop that's defending that pawn, or technically it would be the bishop on c8 that would be defending the pawn on e6. But for white, this bishop is already on b2. So that means that this pawn is going to become a target if you ever try to activate your position with f3, and that's going to create a lot of problems. Secondly, after you play a move like c4, which is the main move in these positions, let's say knight to e7 here, the problem for the white pieces is that this pawn being on b3, this allows the queen to access b3, which means that you cannot increase your pressure on d5, which is very, very annoying. And b4 is actually a good move in this position. It's actually one of the best moves in this position for white, and the idea is to go queen b3 and also to expand on this side of the board. So this is one of the main ways to play this position for white. But the problem still remains, and the idea still remains, that playing a move like knight f to d2 just goes into a worse advanced French. That's why you cannot retreat this knight. And now we are getting to the main idea. I know I delayed this for a while now because I was explaining some other stuff, but the main idea of this segment is that after you strike with the center, they go e4. You don't want to retreat the knight. You want to counterattack with d5. And after you counterattack, you also open up your bishop, and you're playing a very active game. So let's say a move like knight to b4 is played. You're going to go knight g5, countering this pawn. Knight takes d5, knight takes e4, knight takes, and then queen takes d5. And we're going to get a sequence of moves like this. Let's say knight to f6 is played, queen to d4, and let's say bishop to e7 by black. And there's even a cool trick after knight to c3. If black castles, which is inaccurate, black should actually play d5 here. But if black castles, which looks like a very natural move, you can play knight to d5. And black cannot take because he gets checkmated, And if this is played, then you can do a couple of different things. You can just probably just castle queenside and keep a lot of pressure over here. If a move like c6 is played, then you take on e7, rook e7, and then all of a sudden you win a pawn here. So this is also a very, very interesting position. You have to be a little careful though. There's rook d7, which wins the rook, but not quite, because there's bishop takes f6, and after g takes f6, there's queen g3 with a check. So you have to be a little careful with the white pieces. And of course, if queen takes here, then we trade the queens. That makes sense. But the main idea is that if you're going to go for this knight to f3, knight f3, d4 idea, you have to play d5. You cannot retreat this knight. You have to play d5 immediately and not allow black to play d5. So knight after d2, there's d5 by black. This line of d4 also works if they go f5, for example. Let's say you play knight to f3 and black plays f5. The same idea applies here. So this would be something like, I don't even know what is the name of this, reversed something. If you go c4, it's the reversed Grand Prix, I guess. But I'm not sure what this is. I'm not sure what to call this. But you can play d4, and after e4, once again, you don't want to retreat the knight. You want to play d5. So this is a very important idea that you have to remember. Now let's talk about this knight f6 g6 line, which is the Indian variation of the Nimzo-Larsen attack. And there are a couple of ways you can play this position. For example, you can go knight f3 g3 and go for a double fianchetto setup. But the main line, which is actually not the best line according to the computer, but it is still the main line in this position, and that is the take on f6. And after this e takes f6, you have a very nice setup. So I'm going to explain this setup right now. So what you want to do is you want to play c4. Now, the best way to play for black is to go d5 or c6 d5 immediately. Now, the problem is that a lot of people here don't know that and play bishop to g7, which leads to very good positions for the white pieces. Once you play knight to c3 and then rook to c1, just guarding the knight, what you want to do here is you want to play g3, you want to play e3 as well. So a rare situation when you want to play both of these moves simultaneously. If they go d5, you want to capture, and what you want to do is you want to have one knight on c3, you want to have a bishop on g2, and you want to have the knight on e2 to go to f4. So what that looks like is something like this right here. So knight on c3, knight on f4, and a bishop on g2. And all of them are aiming towards this pawn on d5, which is a huge target in a lot of these positions. And this is already better for white, because white has tremendous pressure. The black knight has to go back to guard this pawn, but actually you're not guarding anything at all. There are tactics. There's literally knight takes d5 here, and if rook takes c1, knight takes e7, in between move queen e7, queen c1, you're up a pawn in a winning position. So this is a very, very nice setup for the white pieces, and it works as long as black does not play d5 immediately. So if black doesn't play d5 or black doesn't play c6 d5, this setup is something that you can go for. So e3 and then knight e2, knight to f4. It's a very powerful setup, and it basically immediately gives you better positions for the white pieces, and it is the most common way that people play in this position. Bishop g7 is by far the most common move here. It is played in 82% of the games in the Lichess database, 82%, and it is actually a very, very suboptimal line for black. d5 is played in 7% of the games, and those are actually in the higher elo brackets mostly. So there's a big difference between these two lines right here. I have a line prepared for d5 as well. I'm not going to talk about it right now because it's like really theoretical, and it goes into some very, very weird and advanced ideas. Once again, the line itself is going to be in the study, so you guys can click the link down below. You can go to the study and you can look at this in your own time. And lastly, I want to talk about the symmetrical variation by the black pieces. So playing the symmetrical variation is actually not that great for black, because you can play this move e4, and this is the only time where you're kind of going to deviate from your typical plan of like bishop b2, e3, knight f3, d4. Against b6, you don't want to play any of that. You want to play e4 right away. And if black plays e5, this is very funny. If black plays e5, you have to treat this position as if you're playing e4, e5, except b3 and b6 has been played for some reason. So for example, if you play e4, e5, b3, and for some reason black copies you with b6, you get the exact same position. And the way you would play this position with e4, e5 is you would play knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, so the Italian game, but with b3 and b6. And this is actually advantageous for white because white gets to move first, right? So white's going to be causing all the problems for black. And the problem for black is that this knight in a lot of lines is going to be undefended. So let's say bishop to c5 is played here, castles, knight to f6, c3, trying to play for d4. This pawn cannot move. There are no d5 moves here. d5 looks like a very interesting move in a lot of these lines, but the problem is you always have bishop to b5. So black can even play knight e4. Okay, maybe not d5 immediately, but knight e4 and then d5, you always have bishop to b5. And now you see the downside of b3 and b6 for black. This is the downside for black because this knight is undefended in these lines, which creates a lot of problems for black. But white is very safe because black doesn't have enough time to take advantage of the fact that b3 has been played. So a very funny line, I might say. But the best thing to do for black is to just go bishop to b7. So if they played the symmetrical variation, there's a high chance that they might play e5 as well. But if they don't, if they just go bishop to b7, well, in this case, you're going to continue with knight to c3, say e6, and then bishop to b2. Say they go c5, you can just play d4, and then you can go into a position like this, which resembles something like the Magnus Sicilian, where after d4, queen takes on d4, and the queen goes back to either d2 or e3. You can drop the queen back to d2 as well. This is like very normal in these positions. You can play queen e3 as well. And this has been known to be completely fine for white, and you still have a lot of pressure with the white pieces. So this is still slightly better for white. And if black doesn't know what he's doing, once again, black dies immediately. So for example, if d6 is played, it's just game over. f4 and e5, how are you stopping this? Like, how are you stopping e5 in this position? You have to move the queen out of the way, but now there's knight to b5. If you go queen to b8, there's f5 chipping away at this e6 pawn. If e5 is played, then you continue developing. You go king to b1, castles, and then you can go g4 and just start an attack on the g file. You can sacrifice the pawn completely, and then you can move the queen over to e2, rook to g1, and you can get a massive attack on the black king. So this is an absolutely devastating position that black absolutely does not want to go into. And this line with d4 and then queen to e3 is very dangerous. This has been the theme throughout this entire video. If black doesn't know a very concrete set of moves and a set of like refutation, black gets a worse position immediately, and you're like immediately winning with the white pieces. So this is how I would personally choose to play against the symmetrical line right here. So that's going to be it for today's video. This is going to be a very, very long video. I haven't finished editing it yet, so it's probably going to be more than an hour long. It's probably going to be like hour and 20 minutes or something like that, I would assume. But I hope you enjoyed the video regardless, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.